Okay. Good evening. I'm Jordan Petsas, Chair of the Economics and Finance Department. Apologize that we started a little bit late, but I guess it's Greek time. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to the University of Scranton for a unique opportunity to hear from distinguished experts on one of the most pressing issues in today's global economy, the Greek and European crisis. We are privileged to have 4 accomplished guests joining a panel of University of Scranton faculty to offer the perspectives on the state of this crisis. As we're all aware, this crisis reaches well beyond the confines of Europe and affects the well-being of the entire global community. You can expect a lively and perhaps lengthy discussion, given that 5 of our panelists are Greek. Organizing an event such as this requires the collective effort of many. So at this point, I would like to thank the Zuckerberg Foundation for the financial assistance, the members of the Department of Economics and Finance for the contributions, especially Ms. Janice McAdon, our department's administrative assistant, for her tireless efforts to ensure the success of this program, and officers and moderators and students of both the International Business Club and the Finance Club for their assistance and enthusiasm. The panel members deserve special thanks, since without the participation, this event would not be possible. At this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Susan Trassler, a faculty member of the Department of Economics and Finance, the director of Fulbright Program, moderator of the International Business Club. Dr. Trassler will serve as moderator for this evening keynote presentation and panel discussion. Please enjoy the event.
Thanks, Jordan. Good evening, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to be here tonight to serve as moderator for this important event. Before we begin, though, I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce our panelists to you. Now, rather than go into detail on those of us from the University of Scranton, let me simply point out that we have brief biographies of the 4 of us on the back of your program. So you want to know about us, you can take a look there. I will introduce you and point out who's who. You've already met Dr. Jordanis Petsas, Jordan, the chair of our Economics Finance Department. Clearly, he's from Greece. On the other end of the table is Dr. Christos Pargianos, the newest member of our department. And yes, he's from Greece. Next to him is Dr. John Kalianitis, and you get the idea, another Greek. Yes, I'm lucky enough to have 3 Greek, not just Greeks, 3 Greek men in my daily work life. But tonight, I'm even luckier that tonight we have 4 guests for me to introduce to you. Next to Dr. Kalianitis is Senator John Blake, Senator of Pennsylvania's 22nd Senate District. Now, John is a local product. He's a native of northeastern Pennsylvania, a graduate of Villanova, and with master's degrees from both Marywood University and the University of Scranton. So Senator Blake not only represents this area in Harrisburg, but is also an adjunct faculty member in our department. And so welcome this evening, Senator Blake. Our next guest is Professor George Herakles, who is professor of macroeconomics at the University of Athens. He received his BA from Aristotle University in Thessaloniki, Greece, his MPhil from the University of Glasgow in Scotland, and his Ph.D. from the University of Cincinnati. So he likes to travel. Connecticut. Oh, I'm sorry, Connecticut. Among his many roles of interest to us here tonight, he's been a visiting scholar at the European Central Bank in Frankfurt, a research economist at the Bank of England in London, and is currently not only president of the European Economics and Finance Society, but since 2010, is also a member of the Council of Economic Advisors to the Ministry of Finance in Greece. Welcome. Our sixth panelist, Professor Lawrence Kotlikoff, is Professor of Economics at Boston University. He received his BA in economics from the University of Pennsylvania, so he has an almost local connection, and his Ph.D. from Harvard. As a noted macroeconomist, he's published 14 books, hundreds of articles, and is a regular contributor to publications such as Forbes, Bloomberg, the Financial Times, and he's a blogger for The Economist. He's also served as a consultant to the IMF and the World Bank and to OECD, and has consulted to governments and central banks of 10 countries by my count. In the early 80s, in fact, Professor Kotlikoff was the senior economist with the President's Council of Economic Advisors under Ronald Reagan. Clearly, he's well aware of both the challenges and complexity of national economic policy and national politics. His latest foray in that direction, which we've just learned about, is that in January, just a few weeks ago, Professor Kotlikoff announced his candidacy for presidency of the United States. I kid you not. He is a third-party candidate for President of the United States, and I'm sure he's going to mention it later. So clearly, we've got a well-stocked panel to discuss the issues tonight. Indeed, someone suggested perhaps I should have borrowed my daughter's soccer referee whistle to keep this panel in order. 5 Greeks and 2 politicians, who knows. So to start us off tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. Though born in Athens, Professor Herakles Polemarchakis did his undergraduate and graduate work here in the United States, receiving his undergraduate degree from Yale and his PhD from Harvard. His academic history had him teaching on the faculties of Harvard, Columbia, Louvain in Belgium, Brown, and now since 2006 as Professor of Economics at the University of Warwick in England. Now, for those whose geography of the UK is sorely lacking, Warwick University is just outside Coventry, which is in the Midlands, okay? Now, a specialist in economic theory with an emphasis on the theory of economic policy, Dr. Polemarchakis has a remarkable list of publications. And while I know that 1 or 2 of you might enjoy my reading the titles of the 79 journal articles and 20 or so other publications, I think it best I simply focus on another aspect of his career. From 2005 to 2008, he served as the economic advisor to PASOK, the Socialist Party in Greece. From 2009 to 2011, he was the economic advisor to Greece's Prime Minister, George Papandreou. Following Papandreou's resignation last fall, he currently serves on the Council of Economic Advisors to Greece's Ministry of Finance. So I think it's clear then that he knows what he's talking about in tonight's keynote presentation, which he is entitled, Greece at the Brink. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Professor Herakles Polemarchakis.
So I would like to start by thanking the organizers for this wonderful event, and in particular, Dr. Trussler, Dr. Petsas, and of course, Macedon for the impeccable organization of what's going on today. Now, we had a couple of sessions before the main event, which is tonight, and the questions and the level of information that seemed to be at the disposal of the students who asked questions during these events make me understand that there was much higher awareness of what is going on in Greece, and information that I thought might be apocryphal or at least not widely known seem to be available to everybody. So I'm a bit embarrassed because I prepared remarks which I had thought would serve to give you an overall picture of what happened in the last 15 or 20 years, how we got where we are, and what I think are the prospects from now on. So I apologize in advance if I say things which are known to many of you. At least they will be the starting point for a conversation that I guess is supposed to follow. Okay? Now, when I was asked to give a title for the talk, I was at a loss. I didn't know what to say. So this title was not a very imaginative solution to the problem. Now, unfortunately, after I gave this title, it's Greece at the Brink, which covers, I mean, it's an accurate description of what I had in mind and what I would like to talk about. I read in The Economist a line that I wish I had known before I had given the title. And the line, I don't know if it was Churchill who said it. He has said so many wonderful things that one is tempted to attribute this to him as well. But apparently either Churchill or somebody equally smart used the phrase, there is a ledge after the brink. So I guess that if I knew this, I would have said that that's exactly the question that I want to take up. Is there a ledge after the brink, or are we lost without hope? But so that's the question that I want to address. That's a better title. I wish I could change it. They change it retroactively. So is there a ledge after the brink? Okay, so that's the question. And I realize this is a talk, so there isn't, I much prefer the more informal setup where people can ask questions and have a discussion. I guess we'll have to do it in a more orderly fashion and limit the questions to after the talks. But if somebody feels the urge to ask a question, at least I don't mind at all. It would be much better. Anyway, so Greece, with only around 2% of the output, the size of the Greek economy is only 1.92% of the size of the European economy, and of course a much smaller percentage of the world economy, has been at the eye of the financial storm that has been raging ever since 2008. Now, you realize that there are two crises that we are talking about. There is the crisis that one could refer to as the Lehman Brothers crisis that started in the starting date, if one is to put a date to it, would be the point in mid-September of 2008 when Lehman Brothers went out of business. And there is the follow-up crisis, if you want, that we refer to as the Greek crisis, which is the subject of today's event. And the turning point, probably, in this crisis was the date in May 2010 when Greece appealed to the IMF for assistance. It was a bit of a shock that Greece decided to do so. I shall talk about it later on, but I do remember that there were discussions before May 2010, the spring from winter and spring of 2010, prior to the decision to appeal to the IMF, where there was strong opposition, even to a discussion of Greece appealing to the IMF. And there was a quote, I didn't hear it, but I heard people who claimed they heard it, that when President Sarkozy was told by probably the Greek Prime Minister or a Minister of Finance, that they were thinking of going to the IMF, his response was, Greece is not Botswana. This was a derogatory way of referring to the possibility of appealing to the IMF. This is something that third world countries do. Members of the European Union would never stoop that low. Nevertheless, it was done. And surprisingly, we shall talk about it later, this was done at the request or at the insistence of the German government, which very suddenly changed its position on the matter, and from a strong opposition to any talk of appeal to the IMF, turned out to be the government that demanded that, or so saying, the impression was that it was the insistence of Germany that the IMF be brought into the picture. Now, there is a saying, I think this is attributed to it is due to Oscar Wilde, that it doesn't matter what is bad is to be forgotten. It doesn't matter what they say about you as long as they talk about you. By that criterion, Greece has been doing very well in the last couple of years. But it is one of the cases that are not to which this view is not really applicable. The situation in Greece is very painful. It is a cause of, or a source of shame for policymakers that could or should have prevented events from developing the way they did. To some extent, it is a cause of shame for the citizens of Greece who let themselves be governed by politicians that allowed, not to say caused, the situation to develop as badly as it did. And after all, there were free elections in Greece, so the politicians that are now blamed were freely and democratically elected. So there is some responsibility of the citizens that they did not prevent the situation from developing as it did. But more importantly, it is a painful situation for a large segment of the population in Greece, the majority probably, that are suffering through a period of fifth in a row decrease in national income, of pensions and salaries that are not particularly high, being cut back to levels that are on borderline subsistence levels. So it is a painful situation, and there is no, it is not pleasant at all. And that's something that I think should be kept in mind. So to start with, let's look at how we got, what were the signposts on this road to perdition. There was actually there was some event in Greece where some other Tom Hanks movie was used. I forget what it was, but I thought that Road to Perdition was more applicable to the situation. So how did it all, what were the major, what were the events that happened? If we look back at the last 50 or 60 years of Greek history, what were the main events? Okay, so let's start after the war, after the Second World War, in the late 40s and 50s. So in the late 40s, there was a civil war in Greece. How did this come about? Well, communist or communist-friendly forces had played a dominant role in the resistance to the German occupation during the war, okay? And after the war was over, these forces thought that they could make a bid to take over power in Greece. This attempt failed, and it failed, they lost, okay? They were defeated by the nationalist Greek army, of course aided by the British and then the Americans. But the crucial event there was the agreement in Yalta, where, if I understand correctly, the world was divided. It was a meeting between Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, and Greece was clearly assigned to the Western Bloc, and hence the communist insurrection lost any kind of support that it might have had. So they lost the war, and in the 50s and early 60s, there were conservative governments in power in Greece. They were staunchly anti-communist, respect for civil liberties. I mean, there were elections, but elections were not particularly free. There was a parliament, but civil liberties were not particularly respected. These were the 50s and early 60s. In the mid-60s, there was a liberal government that got elected. The man who was elected as prime minister at the time was the grandfather of George Papandreou, the man who was, until 6 months ago, prime minister, the prime minister who decided, who went to the IMF and who presided, if you want, during the last 2 years of Greek history. So George Papandreou Sr. was elected as the liberal prime minister following these conservative years in the early 60s. This government lasted only for not even 2 years. The government fell in 1965. There was a period of about a year and a half, where short-lived governments succeeded one the other, and there was a military coup in 1967. Now, when I say that these were conservative governments in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, I don't only mean that they were politically conservative, also the economic policy was quite conservative. It suffices to say that there was a currency committee that decided not only there was no independence between the central bank and the fiscal authorities of the Ministry of Finance, but also it was the currency committee that decided the investment policies of private banks. And they decided what investments should be funded, what should not be funded. So it was the situation was far from the way that the organization of the economy was very different from what we understand as a free market, even if we put this in quotes. Nevertheless, the growth, if one measures the economic performance of a government by the rate of growth, I think we can all be suspicious of statistics, but if there is one statistic that we can look at, the rate of growth is probably the first thing that comes to mind. The rate of growth of Greece at the time was around 6 or 7%. Now, I've always been suspicious of data, of numbers that come out, and this not relying, not trusting numbers that come out has played an important role in recent developments in Greece. But I still remember in the 60s, I was very young then, but my mother worked in the economic research department of the Bank of Greece. And as a little kid, I remember my mother mentioning that they would get a phone call from the Ministry of Finance telling them what the growth rate had been. And I thought of economics as the professionals who take this number, which is 7 or 8%, and the question is, how do you arrange the numbers so that this number is confirmed? So when I hear now that Greece grew at 6 or 7% in the 60s, I don't say anything, but I very vividly remember this event. Now, as I said, in 67, there was a military coup. Why was there a military coup? As I said, there was a period of unstable governments, and there were elections coming up. There were elections that had been scheduled for the 28th of May, 1967. And it was taken for granted that Papandreou, the man who had been thrown out of office by the king at the time, effectively, would win, and would win big. Now, nobody can be sure about what actually happened, but the story that's being said is that among those that were afraid and opposed to a decisive victory by Papandreou, by the Center Union Party, it was called, it was a liberal democratic party, they were afraid that if he were to win with a landslide, then he would be much harder to control than had been the case until then. But the dispute was, if there is a landslide, and if we need, meaning the nationalist forces, the ones that were opposed to Papandreou and the center, the more conservative politicians, if you want. Remember, Greece had a king at the time as well, it was a monarchy. So the dispute was, do we stop him before the elections or after? And the king had a plan to take over the government, to intervene in case there was a decisive victory by the Center Union Party in the elections in 1967. There were generals or the top rank military that would be involved in this. They decided what happened, but they had to wait for the elections. Wait for the elections, hope for the best, and things go badly, intervene exposed. But there was a bunch of lower ranked military officers who who moved in and took over the government in April 67 before the elections. So the elections were never held. Subsequently, the king was thrown out as well, and he has not been seen ever since. There has been some discussion about, I don't think, with the situation as bad as it is now, I was joking with friends saying, I'm surprised that the king has not tried to make a comeback, but I think this is a bit of a, right. He lives in England, okay? Now, the performance, the military did not, as far as the economy is concerned, the growth rate they managed to attain. Again, the extent to which it was a true growth rate or not, I don't know. But at least when one reads books and statistics now, the growth rate during the military years, which were 67 to 74, was even higher, it was 8%. But there was an oil crisis in 1971, it was, no? And then the economic situation deteriorated very rapidly, and the military, they created a mess in Cyprus, so there was almost a war with Turkey, and they lost power, and the politicians came back in July 1974. Now this July 74, when the military were ousted and the politicians came back, was a good, it serves as a starting point for discussions of the situation, the economic history or history more generally of current Greece, if you want. There's this break point of the military, and we start looking at, when we look back, we look up to 74 and see what happened then, afterwards. Now, then the events that followed, again, I'll move a bit more quickly right now. A conservative prime minister by the name of Karamanlis took over. And in 1981, Greece entered the became a member of the European Union. Remember, the euro didn't exist at that point. It was just the old European Economic Commission, the EEC as it was called. Later it was renamed to the European Union. And then an important event for the politics of the country is that in the fall of 1981, after accession to the European Union, Greece elected Papandreou II. There are three Papandreous in this story, okay? There is the grandfather who was prime minister in the 60s. There was his son, an economist, chairman of the Department of Economics at Berkeley. Andreas was his name, and he was elected prime minister in 1981. I shall go later, I shall talk about what happened during his premiership. But to talk about the purely economic events for the moment, in 1981, Greece enters the EU. In 1992, there is the Maastricht Treaty, which is important because it sets criteria for membership in the monetary union that was being constructed at that time. And the Maastricht criteria imposed targets, they were supposed to be binding targets, concerning the deficit and the debt and inflation targets for the members of the European Union. And the targets that were set were that government debt should not exceed 60% of GDP, and the deficit should not exceed 5%, I think, and 3%, yes, 3%. And how they do this computation, I think, is very simple. They think that a reasonable growth rate, nominal growth rate, is 5%, okay? And it's a quick computation that 60% of 5% is 3%, and that's how this combination of these numbers, they come a bit out of a hat, but they puzzled me for a long time with these 5, 3, and 6. Where do they come from? Until I realized the fact that 60% of 5 is 3, so, and that's what does it. Okay, so in 1992, the Maastricht Treaty is signed, and in 2001, Greece enters the euro. Okay? Now, how about growth at that period. The 80s were a very bad period. In the 80s, rate growths were very low. I don't know if they were negative at any point, but they may have been. Yes. Nevertheless, if they were not negative, they were hovering around 0. 90s and the early, what do you call the numbers that start with 0?
We call them the noughties.
Noughties.
Well, no, Americans don't, but we do.
Okay, I understand. Okay. So the last decade of the 20th century and the first half of the first decade of the 21st century, growth rates picked up again, and that was the period before Greece before Greece adopted the euro. I repeat, the 80s were a bad period. Now, I think Papandreou himself, however one assesses his performance, is a man who understood. After all, he was an economist. He was a very peculiar type of economist. I mean, he was doing more philosophy of science applied to economics. But he understood economics, and he was a smart man, so I think it was a conscious choice. He thought that growth rates is not what mattered. After all, the country had come out of a rather oppressive regime, and it was important to civil liberties and the participation of the population, redistribution, if you want, were what mattered, and that's what he emphasized, with bad results in terms of conventional indices, if you want. I mean, the debt was tripled from 30% to about 90 or 100% of GDP. The growth rate, as I said, was under 1%. And spending, government spending as a proportion of GDP went from 29% to 49%. So you see the public sector bloated and growth rate doing very badly, and the debt increasing. The socialists are still in power. Andreas Papandreou, his party is still in power. He has died in the meantime, but he's succeeded by the man by the name of Simitis until 2004. And in 2004, the Conservative Party wins the elections, and there is a conservative government from 2004 until 2009. That was a period with miserable and with extremely bad consequences for the economy, and that's where the debt really picked up as a proportion of GDP. And if you ask yourself, where did the money go? That's a question many people had asked. The debt has gone up. What was the money spent on? The answer, I think, is very simple. The money was spent on government consumption, and by government consumption, I mean hiring people in the public sector. That's where the money went. Too many things, but roughly that's where it went most of the time. 2009, there are elections. The socialists win again. The third Papandreou comes in power, also by the name of George. He wins the elections in September 2009, and then the crisis erupts. Why? Because in 2009, 2009 was a terrible year in terms of the statistics that the Greek government announces. They went from predictions of the deficit at about 3%. After a sequence of revisions that lasted until 2011, by the last revision, it had reached 15%. Okay? So, you see what I'm saying? So, we're talking about the deficit in the same year. They started out by announcing, I think before the Conservatives went out of power in September 2009, they announced the deficit was around 3 or 4%, and these numbers were being revised month after month, even retroactively, and by the early 2011, the latest revision, it was that the deficit had been, of 2009, was 15% of GDP. This combined with two other problems. What are the two other problems? The two other problems were the fact that in the campaign for the 2009 elections, Papandreou used a fatal phrase, which is when asked, because he would promise things as politicians do in election time, he would promise various things, and when asked about how are you going to fund, where is the money going to come from, he gave this answer that must be haunting him, where he said there is money. Now, of course, you can come back and say that I don't think he lied. I think what he had in mind was to say that, of course, there is money. The question is where you spend the money. But I think he has been criticized on many things. I think this is the last thing to criticize him on. Nevertheless, combined with the numbers that were coming out and they were worse every time that they were being revised, this destroyed the credibility of the country in financial markets. Okay, the premia, the spreads on Greek bonds started skyrocketing, and the recourse to the IMF became almost unavoidable, and that's what Papandreou decided to do on April 23rd, 2010. He announced that he was going to appeal to the IMF, and the contract or the loan agreement with the EU, with the European Union and the IMF was signed in May 2010. Now, one question is, so this is the sequence of events. So the first question that one can ask is, whose fault? Why did the situation in Greece deteriorate so badly? And there are two, roughly speaking, there are two explanations. One is that it's the fault of profligate politicians that spend money that the government doesn't have. There was combined with corruption, inefficiencies, tax evasion, and drops in productivity. The productivity, labor productivity, hourly productivity of labor is in 2009, the productivity of Greek labor was at 44% of the EU average. So the productivity score, Greece is doing terribly, and at the same time it keeps spending money, as I said, that it doesn't have. So profligate, irresponsible politicians plus corruption is one story. The other story is that it is the EU that is to blame. Now, be careful what you mean that it's the EU to blame. The story is that the claim, the competing theory is that when Greece entered the European Union, there was, on the one hand, euphoria. People thought that growth is coming, incomes will be much higher in the future, and as we teach in economics courses, when are people entitled or justified to borrow? Well, if you know that your future income is going to be higher than your current income, then it's logical and appropriate to borrow and consume more today. I don't know, consumption smoothing, if you want to push it. But of course, the problem is how sure are you that indeed the income is going to be higher in the future? As it turned out, it was not expectation that was fulfilled, okay? In addition, of course, the membership of Greece, the fact that Greece was now not printing its own money, but was a member of the Euro Club, led to a rapid decrease in interest rates. Okay? So people could borrow, had access to loans at very low rates, which they had never had before. So the combination of expectations of high income in the future and low interest rates made it very tempting, and if expectations were correct, also rational, to borrow. And that was the borrowing that led to the skyrocketing, to the increase in debt. Now, as a friend of mine described the situation very succinctly, he said there is nothing to explain. Greece has been borrowing 10% of its GDP every year for 10 years. 10 times 10 gives you 100, and if you start compounding, then you arrive at the numbers of 120, 150, whatever the numbers are right now. It has been overspending for the last 10 years. Now, I don't know. I think both of these are contributing factors to the situation. I don't think one can separate one from the other. the politicians were irresponsible, the system is corrupt, and was corrupt, and at the same time, the ability to borrow was too large a temptation for the population, and the government in particular, not to take advantage of. So first question is, what caused the crisis? And as I said, these are the two explanations, and both contribute to, they were both there, and they reinforced each other. Now, another question that we should look at is, could the crisis, I mean the climax, the problem was there, it could not be avoided. The question is, could the crisis have been avoided? Was it Papandreou's fault that it happened? Could he have done that? Could he have done something to stop it? There was a very unfortunate metaphor used by Papandreou's Minister of Finance, George Papakonstantinou, who, in order to describe his job, which was he was Minister of Finance in Greece, he described the task that he was in charge of as being the captain of the Titanic. Now, the Titanic didn't do very well, so it was it was a slip of the tongue that has been haunting him. I mean, like Papandreou is haunted by this, there is money promise in the campaign. Papakonstantinou will always be remembered for the reference to his job as being captain of the Titanic. Okay, that, I've heard him explain what he had in mind when he said this, but this doesn't help very much. So I think the measures could have been taken. Probably not, but probably by the time Papandreou took over in September 2009, it may already have been too late. If people had been aware of the problem, given what they knew by the spring of 2009, mind you, this is 1 year before the IMF, the recourse to the IMF, okay? That was still the conservative government, before Papandreou took over. If a war situation was declared at a time, maybe they could have averted the crisis. And another thing that has been said is that Papandreou not only said there is money, and you see this, there is money, why is this? It is not, the problem with this phrase, there is money, is not that he created expectations. Who cares about what the people expected? They could have been told, sorry, this was campaign talk, now it's real talk, and there is no money, okay? The problem is that markets believed that he was going to spend. So the markets did not believe that he was going to rein in spending because of the campaign promises, of the promise he had made during the campaign. So when markets started, when the spreads started increasing, was after Papandreou took over, and the logic of the argument is now markets, having heard him say that there is money, we interpret this as a statement which is, I'm going to spend because there is money, and if he's going to spend, the debt is going to get out of control. Also, the stories about Greek corruption, Greek data, it even became a phrase, Greek data, Greek statistics was something that was a phrase that became a slogan in the European Union, and not only. He is accused of having contributed to this problem because when he went as a freshly elected prime minister to meetings in the European Union, and later on in this meeting in Davos that takes place every January, February, whatever it is, he was very critical and spoke very openly about the corruption situation in Greece. He's quoted as saying, as telling people, I don't know if he exactly said it like this, but making statements to the effect, what can I do? You know that I'm prime minister of a corrupt country. Now, I think he did this, first of all, because it was true, okay? And second, because he wanted to convey to his fellow prime minister that he understood the problem. He knew there was corruption. He was not lying, he was being honest. Nevertheless, in some sense, he made people even more aware of the corruption that was haunting the Greek economy, and that made the situation more out of control than would need to be the case. Now, so could have been avoided. These are the arguments that can be raised. So Papandreou takes over in September 2009. The situation deteriorates. The discussion is the European Union going to intervene? Whom are going to ask for help? I think Papandreou, right from the beginning, was very open to the possibility of appealing to the IMF. Many people in his cabinet were opposed to it. Their argument was, this is Europe, because it's a fixation that Greece has about being a member of the club. And also, as I said, European politicians were were opposed to the idea of Greece appealing to the IMF. There was a change of mind, both on behalf of the ECB, of the European Central Bank, which also was strongly opposed to any discussion of the IMF in January, February, March of 2010. Both the European Central Bank and Germany, so one reads in the newspapers, if it's true or not, I don't know, became much more open and much more receptive to the idea of Greece going to the IMF, and even demanded it. Why? Because the Germans were very worried about somebody being tough and scrutinizing very carefully if money is given to Greece, how it's going to be spent and what is going to be done with it. And they had much more confidence in the people in the IMF staff to impose rules, okay, and keep control of the situation than they had on the confidence they would have on the European European Commission doing the task alone. So they wanted to bring the IMF in. It was an admission of weakness or of failure, if you want, on behalf of the European Union or of the Eurozone. But at the same time, the IMF was a guarantee that standards would be applied and would be high and kept. So the memorandum of understanding, there was an aid plan of $110 billion that was agreed upon, and together with it came a whole list of reforms that Greece undertook, committed to undertaking in order to get out of the impasse or the situation where it had found itself. Now, what do we think about this? The policies that were proposed and imposed by there is this term that you've all heard, the Troika, because there are three people that are lending money to Greece right now. The funds come from the IMF, and so it is three, in a ratio of 3-to-8, the IMF versus Europe on the other, and the three authorities that decide, that control the situation are the IMF, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank. And that's why people refer to the Troika as the committee that looks over the situation. Now, they imposed, as I said, a list of measures that had to be implemented. And what is the recipe that they propose? The recipe is very simple. The recipe is to say, first of all, you balance your budget. You don't balance we are a long way from balancing the budget, okay? But you control spending, you reduce your deficit, you reduce your debt. That's another word for it is, what's the word, fiscal?
Consolidation.
Yeah, fiscal consolidation. So fiscal consolidation is one leg of this argument, and the other are structural reforms. Now, what are structural reforms? Removing barriers to competition. Okay? So making markets operate as competitively as possible. The flaw in the argument is that it stops there. That is, it is an article of faith, and that's how this memorandum, that's how these policies were constructed, to say you balance your books, you remove barriers from competition, and then markets will operate and growth is going to be at your doorstep. Now, I think this is much stronger faith in the efficiency of markets than is warranted. But it is clear that this is what the recipe and the IMF will not deny this. They will say this is how they think. Okay? There is another dimension, however, and there the IMF is not to blame, and the other is the equity dimension. The equity dimension is what? The equity dimension is to say, yes, you have to limit spending. You have to cut back on government expenditures. Now, what do you cut back? You have to cut back on salaries and pensions of civil servants. Do you cut across the board, or do you try to maintain some kind of equal share? Well, fair, not equal. Equal is not fair in this sense, okay? And I think the reductions and the cutbacks in salaries and pensions has been much more horizontal than it should have been. Yes, there has to be an attempt to, there has been an attempt to shield the very low earners and the very small pensions from cutbacks that should be higher for those who earn more, but I think that the extent to which the cuts and the reductions were equitable is very limited. Much more effort should have been made to share the burden more fairly. Now, the package was given, the aid was given, $110 billion. The situation did not improve because Greece did not manage to reduce its deficits as much as it should have. Recession got worse, so GDP fell more than had been expected. And of course, if the denominator falls, then this doesn't do you good in terms of reducing the debt to GDP ratio. And it soon became apparent that a second aid package would be required, and the second aid package is what is being negotiated right now. In the meantime, the Papandreou government, Papandreou had to resign as prime minister and his government replaced by a strange construction, which is not, unlike Italy, the two things happened almost at the same time. You know, Berlusconi was thrown out of office in Italy, and Papandreou left office in Greece. But Berlusconi was replaced by a government of technocrats, the people that formed. Monti, the prime minister, is not a politician, but neither are most of the members of his cabinet. It is not the case in Greece. In Greece, what replaced the Papandreou government is a coalition government between the two major parties and a fringe, extreme right-wing party that has even pulled out by the coalition by now, but let's forget it's an irrelevance for what we're talking about. So the two major parties, the conservative New Democracy Party and the center socialist PASOK, Papandreou's party, they are the ones which are in a coalition government right now, headed by a non-politician prime minister, Lucas Papademos, who was the, his last position was to be vice governor of the ECB, from which he retired about a year ago. Now, the new aid package has been agreed upon. It is not a done deal. Why? Because the new aid package is a package of 130 billion euros, again coming with a list, a repetition more or less, of the structural reforms that will cure the problem. Only now Greece is much more, the European Union and the IMF are much more careful to make sure that these reforms are indeed made into law and implemented, the extent to which this can be assured. Why am I saying that this is not a done deal? It's not a done deal because there is 130 billion euros that will be given to Greece to pay its debts. This protects Greece from, Greece will not have to enter the financial markets until 2015, what is it, 20 or 20? Until now, 2020, Greece does not have to borrow anymore. It's covered. Its needs are covered by this 130 billion package. But, and that was at the insistence of the Germans, and the French signed up to it, there is going to be a restructuring of Greek debt that is supposed to be voluntary. It comes by the name of private sector involvement, meaning those to whom Greece owes money agree to be paid less and to be paid later. The loss in present value by the creditors is of the order of 70%. And whether this will be agreed upon whether the creditors will indeed voluntarily participate in this scheme is yet to be decided. Now, realize that participation, that is the success of this private sector involvement, is a necessary condition for the disbursement of the 130 billion euros by the European Union and the IMF. It is not that the money is given and then we also try to get the private sector to GP. No, this money is given only if the private sector initiative involvement goes through, okay? Now, will they agree to this voluntary participation in the restructuring? We don't know. They are deciding right now whether to go ahead or not. What are the issues? Well, what does Greece have recourse to if they don't? Well, the Greek parliament passed a law which, if I understand correctly, says that as long as 60 or 61% agree to participate, then the Greek government can invoke collective action clause. They have the lever of collective action clauses that they can implement and bring everybody in. The problem is that in parallel to this, a parallel problem that goes on is that there are CDS or default insurance that has been bought. This is to the net value of these insurance contracts is $3.5 billion, but word is that if you don't consolidate, because you realize people hold both sides of these contracts, or they buy it from one guy and sell it to the other, the gross position is around $80 billion. So it's a huge amount that may be triggered. So the question is, if the restructuring is not deemed to be voluntary, then this constitutes default. And if it is default, this means that the CDS are triggered, okay? And if the CDS are triggered, there is 80 billion euros that have to change hands in the world financial system. And it is not clear who owes money to whom and what consequences this will have. So on the other hand, as we were discussing with Larry the other day, if it is the case that the deal goes through and is considered voluntary, it makes a bit of a mockery of these insurance contracts, because a 70% reduction in what you are owed can hardly be considered voluntary. Or to put differently, why would I ever buy insurance against being defaulted upon when I lose 70% of what I lent or what I invested, and then when I bought insurance against losing my money, I'm told, no, you voluntarily agreed to the reduction, so the insurance doesn't get paid. So it will kill the CDS market for sovereigns. So it's not clear what position the private sector will take or where this will lead. That's where we stand right now. There are a number of difficulties down the road. Greece has to make difficult decisions. Is it better to stay in the euro, to be in the euro, or out? Of course, there is the obvious argument that if you are not in the euro, being in the euro, it takes away from you an important policy lever, which is devaluation, okay? So you lose an instrument. On the other hand, you gain use of a strong currency that in terms of credibility or the workings of your financial system may be an advantage. The question is, will you be able to take advantage of this advantage? Or should you forego it and get access to this instrument, to this lever, which is a devaluation that you may be able to take advantage of if need be? So in or out of the euro is a question that Greece must make its mind up about. Default is another issue. I mean, why shouldn't just Greece default outright? Argentina did in 2002. Maybe it is better to default, pay the price of exclusion from financial markets, but get rid of this burden that you have a hard time coping with. These are important questions. Furthermore, the politics ahead is very complicated. Why? There are elections coming up. There are elections coming up. No major party, if one is to believe the polls, the elections are going to lead to a period of weak governments. It's not clear that any party will be able to form a majority, to form a government. And if coalition governments must be relied upon, well, coalition governments, especially in a country like Greece, are not the most stable form of government that you can have. Finally, and that's where I have my strongest doubt, so I said there are important questions to be answered. I don't know what decision will be made. Default, the euro, the ones that what we just mentioned, the politics, which is very unclear. But above all, the question is there a willingness to change the bad habits of the past to a healthier, more efficient, less corrupt economy with fewer privileges for various groups? And I must say that reading the papers, and looking at the way people react to what is being asked of them, I have the impression that very often people are all in favor of the reforms, provided it doesn't touch them. And that's a big problem. Now, at the same time, people are going through a difficult time, so you don't know. And that's where the equity dimension comes in. If people are convinced that they pay the price, but so does everybody else, that people don't escape from paying their share, then there may be some hope. So I will leave it at that, and thank you. We'll have questions later.
Thank you. I'm going to skip right on, since we started a little late, and move right on to Dr. Kotlikov and ask him to respond to the question, how and why did this crisis spread to other European countries? So if you could address that issue for us, please.
Well, happy to do so. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. Very impressive university, very impressive faculty. I want to thank the organizers. It's been a great day, and please vote for me. So I'd like to talk about Greece, but I'd like to talk more about myself now. Now, Greece, the way I look at the whole European sovereign debt / euro crisis is, well, it's partly the kinds of things that Herakles, my beloved classmate in grad school, this is how I ended up here. I guess he was asked who to bring along to comment on him, and he picked a friend. So I can't be too tough on him. Oh, this is not working?
It's not on.
I don't know, okay. There you go. Is this better? Maybe it's not? No?
Yeah, that's
Okay,
better.
yeah. Okay, so what I said, just to repeat, is vote for me. Yeah, okay. Herakles and I were at grad school together. We've been friends for a long time. It's delightful to be with him and to hear his take on Greece. My kind of view of it is everything he said, but I also think that the fact that this has hit not just Greece, but the other countries that we're talking about in sovereign debt problems, which are Ireland and Italy and Spain and Portugal, as well as Greece. And then Belgium is kind of borderline, so the acronym without Belgium is, I think, PIGS for these countries, and with Belgium, it's Big Piss would be the term, I think. I want to be the first one to coin that, so it's went out of the way to say that. But why Herakles raised the question at the end? Why can't Greece default? Why can't these other countries default? I mean, after all, the people that lent them money knew that they could default, and they demanded higher interest rates because of that risk of default. I can default on my mortgage if I can't pay it back. I can default on a car loan, or I can't default on a student loan, just so you know. Student loans are not dischargeable in bankruptcy. They stick with you through life, so students be very careful about taking out student loans. They can even take away your Social Security check when you're 65 in order to make sure you pay your student loan. But in general, we can default on our loans as individuals. Companies can default on the loans. Why can't countries default? Well, the answer has to do really with the banking system. So I view the crisis in Europe as in large part a banking crisis, and not that much dissimilar from the banking crisis that we saw in the US in 2008. And what happened is that the banks, they engaged in trust me banking. They borrowed a lot of money. Some of it they took in the form of deposits. Some they sold bonds or time deposit CDs. They said, trust me, we're going to pay you back. They took the money in, and then they bought securities. Now, in the case of the U.S. banks, they bought securities that were rated, some of them were rated AAA, but they turned out to be triple D. So they bought nominally safe securities that turned out to be very risky, and the banks were in a position of going under. And if the banks go under, they're kind of the custodians of this financial exchange system. That's kind of like, imagine all the gas station owners gambling on their businesses, and about all of them were to lose money and to go under and close down all their gas stations. That would shut down the highway system. That would be eliminating a huge transportation system that's critical to market exchange. Well, the banking system, the banks are kind of custodians of this public good, the financial market, the financial exchange system. That's why they couldn't be allowed to go under. That's why they were too big to fail, because they are in charge of this market. They're market makers. And then the question is, well, do you want market makers, critical market makers, to gamble? Do you want gas stations to all gamble on their businesses and all invest in the same thing and go broke at the same time? No. Their job is to pump gas. It's not to gamble. And really the business of banks is to intermediate. It's not to say, trust me, and then go gamble, lose their shirts, and then turn it to the taxpayers. So that's what happened in the US, and this is what happened in Europe. The European, in the case of Ireland, those banks in Ireland borrowed something like 2 times GDP and said, trust me. They invested in things, in a lot of real estate in Ireland that was overvalued. It fell in value. And they were in a position to tell the government, look, you can't let us go under, because if you do, the whole banking system will go under, and there'll be a massive run on the banks, and therefore bail us out. And the Irish government willy-nilly went and took over basically 2 times GDP as a liability. Now there's some assets there, so it may end up being 1 time GDP, but it was really at the root of a banking crisis, and now that debt is on the books of the Irish government. So it spread. So this bank problem spread to Ireland that way. In Greece, you have Greek banks and other banks in Europe that are holding all this Greek debt. And it's not so much that Greece is the size of Ohio in terms of the economy, but if it were to default, then other countries might default, like Italy and Spain. Italy's got a huge amount of debt. It's like the 3rd largest debtor nation in terms of magnitude of debt in the world. So if it were to default, if Italy were to give this example, then other countries might do that. And what would happen? The Greek banks would get into trouble, the German banks, the French banks, the Belgian banks, Italian banks, Spanish banks, even the U.S. banks, because the U.S. banks have sold insurance against default. As Herakles was referring to, the CDS market, which is basically a debt insurance market. We don't know how much obligations Citibank or some other whatever companies were, it could be AIG, it could be JP Morgan, nobody knows because there's this proprietary information, which is the banks are secret keepers. If you guys have read Harry Potter, you know that that's a term that is used in that book. We have a trust me banking system, and these banks are investing in things that they say we can't show you we can't tell you what we're doing. We can't tell you what liabilities we have. You can't see the assets or the liabilities. Trust us. And that's that's brought down our country, and that's what's brought down Europe. I mean, the fact is that the EU, the IMF, the European Financial Stability Facility, all these institutions are there to try and bail out the countries, but they're really there to bail out the banks. Because if the banks go down, the financial system goes down, and we have runs on the banks throughout Europe, and that could spread to the U.S. The financial system is set up in a way to collapse. It's been designed with man-made fragility. And in economics terms, it's got multiple equilibria embedded in it. So I see what happened in the U.S. and in Ireland as making people concerned about the banks, and then they're concerned about the debt, and do they really want to, they start looking at things from a different perspective. The whole trust goes out the door when we have one big company after the next in the U.S. fail, big banks in England fail, and this leads to suspicion about the solvency of these countries, and then you have the financial wolves circling the weakest countries. Now, Greece is one of the weakest countries here in terms of that, but if you look at it carefully, it turns out that the U.S. actually, I think, is in worse fiscal shape than Greece. If you look at not just our official debt, which is very big and getting bigger all the time, but also our unofficial debt, which is massive to pay for the Social Security benefits and Medicare benefits and Medicaid benefits of the baby boomers. I'm 61. When I'm, let's say, 75, I'll be getting like other baby boomers on average $40,000 in today's dollars. That'll be about 80% of per capita GDP. 78 million baby boomers times $40,000 per year is about $3 trillion. That's in today's dollars. So that's the kind of obligation that we're facing, our kids are facing, you young people are facing, thanks to we older people leaving this burden to young people. So Greece has gotten into trouble. Herakles is intimating that there was irresponsible politicians that spent a lot of money they didn't have. Well, this country has been doing that for decades, 6 decades in a row, and our bonds could end up becoming junk bonds. Our safe treasury bills and bonds, I think, are actually riskier in many ways than the Italian debt today and these other countries. So how does this spread? Well, it spreads partly because you have banks, the fragility of the banking system, the fact that the banks have invested in things that they thought were safe, or somebody, they claimed to be safe, but they weren't safe. And then they have to be kept solvent, and that means you have to make sure these assets don't go underwater. And that means bailing out Greece and Italy and Spain and these other countries. And that's exactly what's happening now, which is the European Central Bank is the primary bailer-outer here. They're printing a lot of money. They're funneling it through these banks in Europe, in the Eurozone, to keep them solvent. And those Eurozone banks are now buying up the debt of countries like Italy and also probably Greece to, in effect, bail them out through the back door. So all this could lead to lots of inflation over time because basically, in real terms, there's no free lunch here. And you can't paper over these problems. And the European Central Bank is trying to paper this over, and that'll work out fine as long as it doesn't. As long as it does. As soon as it doesn't, as soon as we start to see high inflation, that's going to be an indication that people understand what's really happened here, which is massive creation of money to try and paper over these fundamental problems. And the fundamental problems are, imprudent, generationally inequitable Ponzi schemes have been run by all these countries in terms of how they've been doing their fiscal finances for decades. And our country is the worst offender here. The other thing is trust me banking, which is inherently unstable. And we've seen this in our country. We need to change both of these things. And if you go to kotlikoff2012.org, you'll see how to do it.
Thank you. Does anyone on the panel want to respond to Professor Kotlikoff's point? Yeah.
Hello, just...
Make sure that we're using the mics, because I think some
Okay.
people in the back couldn't hear.
I think it's fine, okay.
Yeah.
A short response. I agree with what Dr. Kotlikoff said, but I believe that Europeans are partly responsible for this increase, this acceleration of the crisis, because actually they gave money to Greece 2 years ago, and they didn't protect their investment in Greece. So although there was an agreement 2 years ago that the Greece must impose some specific policies, Greece did nothing about that, and Europeans didn't react on this. They knew that nothing was going on in Greece, no reforms, nothing, and they didn't say a word. So just this comment that they are responsible, definitely.
Thank you. Anyone else? John?
I would like to add on this. Actually, the history of loans, it started after the liberation, 1824. The war started in 1821, and the loan starting from England in 1824. And they continue, of course, all the years. Country was defaulting. They start keeping 50 or 70% of the loan in advance for interest. Greece bought 9 warships from England. They never deliver. The money has been paid. One was delivered but was in fire in the middle of Mediterranean. Then the crisis continued. And now, the loan that Greece was receiving all these years, since 1981, the next day, Germany and France mostly, and England, was offering to Greece military equipment. The money was taken back the next day. This money never went to Greece. Greece was just paying interest on these loans, that these loans has become weapons next day.
Let me just add one thing.
Yeah.
I was trying to get across the point. I'm not sure I actually made the point that if we change the banking system, you would be able to have a country like Greece that got into trouble for reasons of its own or reasons of the fact that there was a worldwide global recession. You'd be able to have them default. If the banks were not in a position of being leveraged, having borrowed a lot of money and said for sure we have to pay it back, and then having invested in risky assets, there would not be a problem here. Greece could default, and the banking system would not collapse. So imagine you had a banking system that had no borrowing, that didn't have debt, where all the banks were 100% equity financed. Mutual funds are like that. Mutual funds take in money, they issue shares. Imagine every bank was a mutual fund. They take in money, they give back shares, and then particular mutual funds buy Greek government debt, and the Greek government debt defaults. Well, the mutual fund loses, the assets in the mutual fund lose value, the shareholders lose value, but the mutual fund itself doesn't collapse. The financial infrastructure doesn't go down. The gas stations are still operating. That's what we need to move to reform Wall Street, make it safe for Main Street, to reform the financial system in Europe to make it safe for those countries, those economies, and to let countries default when they need to. Today it's sovereign debt. Yesterday it was subprime mortgages. Tomorrow the banks will buy something else that looks safe, like U.S. Treasuries, and they'll go down. We have to fix the banks fundamentally to save Main Street.
Thank you. If we can move on for a moment here, well, actually, we're moving back to a question that was raised in the keynote, but that I want to address to Dr. Korateas here. The euro. Do you think the euro is going to survive, or do you think that Greece may be headed back towards the drachma? And do you want to come up here or have the clicker?
Because even if I have the clicker, I will not be able to see it.
Right. Let me get your... okay, there you go.
Thank you. I would like to thank Dean Mensa, Chairman Petsas, and their colleagues at the Kanya School of Management for this invitation and the opportunity to be in the same panel with such distinguished speakers. The question is whether Greece is headed back to the drachma, and whether euro will survive. I will start, actually, I cannot answer whether Greece is headed back to the drachma because they didn't let me at the customs to pass my crystal ball. And so instead of doing this, I will say whether it makes sense for Greece to return to a national currency that is focused on a kind of economic arguments, whether it makes sense for the EMU partners, for the other European countries also, Greece's return to national currency. The hard facts are that the external position of the country is characterized by current account deficits and low competitiveness, fiscal concerns, high debt and high deficit, rigidities and inefficient economic and political structures, and recession. So, to respond to these challenges, Greece needs at the moment to improve competitiveness, get its fiscal matters in order, implement the reforms necessary to modernize the economy, and get the economy into a growth path. So, given this, I would say that the question can be rephrased as to whether it is better for Greece to try to achieve these tasks within the Eurozone or outside of the Eurozone with its own national currency and monetary policy autonomy. Let's try to briefly discuss these aspects. Indeed, Greece faces a competitiveness problem. For those of you who can see the screen, the red line shows the unit labor costs in manufacturing in Greece. EL is Greece. Unfortunately, not too many options exist. Some kind of devaluation has to take place, internal or external. Greek products have to become cheaper and foreign products more expensive. At the moment, the option taken by policymakers is the so-called internal depreciation, and whether this is implemented in a competent way is another story that I don't want to address. But this is the option taken by the policymakers. Of course, the adjustment is harsh, and it's more likely to materialize through lower incomes. So the typical argument of those that suggest the return to the drachma is that having the ability to devalue your national currency will improve competitiveness and the current account, and so on. Some observations on this argument. First, leaving the euro and returning to a national currency does not make sense unless the depreciation is of a very high order. It has to be a big-time depreciation. It doesn't make sense to leave the euro, go to national currency and depreciate 10 or 15%. And this is a kind of a response to the arguments that suggest a temporary exit from the euro, a vacation from the euro. Second, the recent history of Greece, of devaluations and depreciation in Greece, suggests that they were not effective. In 1980, to speak in US terms, in 1980, when just before Greece was entering the European Union, the local currency to the dollar, the drachma to the dollar, was 30, if I have my notes here, 42 drachmas to the dollar. And in 2000, just before Greece joins the EMU, it was 309 drachmas to the dollar. So something like 7 times up, 6 or 7 times up. In the same period, however, In the same period, exports were hardly doubled, but the trade deficit quadrupled. And during this period, we had two major devaluations in 1983, 1987, and a continuous stream of depreciations. And take into account that this happened in an environment where protectionist measures were possible. Up to 1993, Greece could take protectionist measures. Since 1993, protectionist measures within the European Union, at least, is a no-no. Another dimension is that Greece is heavily dependent on imports for its own production. So any kind of local currency depreciation will pass through on the export prices and will erode the effects of depreciation. To give you a kind of a figure, in 2010, for example, just the value of imports of oil, chemicals, and minerals, intermediate inputs, exceeded the value of all the exports of Greece. Or to put it another way, out of the $22 billion of Greek exports in 2012, only half of them, exactly $11 billion, only half of them use local raw materials. The rest of the exports have to use imported raw materials. So this makes me very skeptical about the possibility that, about the arguments that a return to the drachma will improve the current account position. Second task is whether getting out of the euro will help improving Greece's fiscal position. Well, I have to tell you that I'm very, very skeptical and very critical about the framework of fiscal rules imposed by the Maastricht Treaty. I think they are arbitrary, and I think, at least my research tries to argue that they are not enforceable. Their enforceability is highly questionable. Nevertheless, let's take them as given. What is the alternative? Who would like, Professor Polemarchakis mentioned earlier about the political system in Greece that is partly responsible for the bad management of fiscal matters. Who would like, therefore, to leave the management of the fiscal matters of Greece to the same political system again and leaving it unconstrained? Moreover, the political forces that suggest an exit from the euro, they share a common feature. They all tend to support reliance to heavy government intervention. It's not accidental that the most forceful voices for an exit from the Eurozone come from the left, the hardcore Communist Party, the Stalinist Communist Party, which is which has a double-digit number in the polls. Leaving the monetary union, the Greek sovereign debt will still be euro-denominated. Of course, the suggestion of leaving the euro comes into one single package with a suggestion to default. So one would say there is no problem. It's difficult to imagine how contracts and debts will be honored in that case. Greece will not be able to borrow in the international capital markets, which is also the case now, but also it will not have access to the sources of lending, of borrowing, that Professor Polemarchakis mentioned, the EU, the ECB, and the IMF. And all of this in an environment where where Greece still has a primary budget deficit. There are important also implications about corporate debt, to which I will refer in 1 second. The third item is the implementation of reforms necessary to modernize the economy. Returning to the national currency is a good excuse for these reforms to stop. Special interests will seize the opportunity to defend their positions. Actually, Greece is full of Vikings. Of course, I'm not a Viking. You know, the Vikings are blonde and tall, unlike me. But and I'm not a Greek Viking. But we have many of Greece's. One of Greece's features is that it's full of Vikings. What are the Vikings? Rent seekers are special interests who do not produce, but who impose obstacles, artificial obstacles, and then ask for a toll to let them pass through. And Greece is full of such inefficiencies. Actually, it's more likely that structural changes may occur, but not in the direction that we would like to see. More likely, it is that if you get out of the common currency, you will have capital outflow. And what do you do then? You impose capital controls. If the banks go bankrupt, you have to nationalize them. And if importing oil is too expensive, then you may have to ration oil at the gas stations. So implementing these reforms will be more difficult. More importantly, the task of getting out of the recession is even worse. Getting out of the euro makes the task of getting out of the recession even more difficult. It's more likely that bank runs, capital flight, collapse of the banking financial system will happen. Also, the implications of defaulting on government debt. There are implications of the defaulting on government debt for corporate debt. Letting aside the corporate ceiling, that is credit ratings of firms are usually lower than that of their governments, local firms will have problems settling contracts and debt with foreign financial institutions. In other words, many firms will go bankrupt. There is some research, some analysis suggesting that past devaluations in Greece didn't have a positive effect on growth, but I don't trust them, so I will skip it. Of course, it contributes to my argument, but this is a broader criticism I have on this discussion of getting out on what will happen. There is not sufficient serious analysis for the scenarios. Even the first memorandum, the first stabilization program that came with the first package of Greece, it was written arbitrarily, literally on the foot. Okay, there is no a serious counterfactual, let's say, to have I don't know a VAR, a global VAR, something, and see Greece, the eurozone with Greece, the eurozone without Greece, and so on. There is not sufficient technical analysis on the matter. So. Let me summarize this issue, saying that if a return to the drachma makes likely that the government's hands are tied by the tight budget constraint with no possibility of borrowing, if the local banks and the businesses have gone bust, if capital flows overseas, if the value of local assets has been depreciated, if foreign capital inflows are unlikely because the inefficient status quo prevails, then who will finance new investment? And where do we expect growth to come from? It doesn't make sense to me. Okay. So some scattered observations, very often discussing the matter, and I often see myself thinking in these terms. So very often I think, well, before, when I was a student, in Greece, in early 90s, things were good, things were not bad. So maybe we should go back. But it is not the same to compare in a vacuum the pre-EMU period with the post-EMU period. The costs of leaving the monetary union are not symmetric to the opportunity costs of not joining the monetary union in the first place. We have to be careful in making these comparisons. The other thing is how Greeks are feeling about it. Now, the polls show that at least 70% to 87% actually of the Greeks, they want to stay in the eurozone. The funny thing is that there was a poll last weekend. Only 13 or 14% were favoring a return to the drachma. In the same poll, the radical left parties, three of them, get get in summary a 30-something% of the total vote. So people, the way that people express their views in the polls is kind of schizophrenic. On one hand, they say that I would like to vote for this particular party that suggests we should leave the Eurozone. At the same time, they say that I would not like to live outside the Eurozone. The point is that, the important thing is that the risk, no mainstream political party would take the risk of getting the country out of the euro because none of the political parties is willing to take this risk of getting the country out of the euro, at least the mainstream parties. Also, I would like to say that suggesting that it's preferable for Greece to stay in the Eurozone for the moment does not necessarily mean that the Eurozone should exist. This is, I think, this refers very much to the point that Susan mentioned earlier on whether the British did well to stay out of the euro. But I believe that as long as the euro exists, a small country, a small open economy, both in terms of economics and politics, is better off being within this club. Dixit calls this club entrapment. I'm trying very often to explain this to my students, that it's something like, I may be the best student in class, and if each one of us, each one of the students studies by himself, by herself, I may be better off. But if my classmates form 2 or 3 study groups, it doesn't make sense for me, no matter how good I am, to stay alone. I have to join one of these groups. Finally, there are some political economic concerns: who stands to win and who stands to lose from an abrupt abandoning of the euro. I will not say more on this. Very quickly, I will say a couple of things on whether the euro will survive. Again, nobody can say what will happen. But if I was to summarize the whole thing, I don't think that the possibility of a breakup, will the euro break up? I cannot say that it is impossible, but I think it is highly improbable. It seems to me that most Europeans are determined to defend the euro. Of course, the recent crisis revealed the flaws in the design of the EMU. It also revealed many tensions, which are natural when you try to implement policy, to design policies covering n national states, 10, 15, 17, 20, how many they are. And in some sense, if you read the literature, you will feel like you feel that a déjà vu. It's like being 1999. The same issues that emerged in the literature a couple of years before the EMU, the Eurozone, was formed, the same issues again have emerged. The point is that sooner or later, the policymakers in the euro area will face some tough decisions. Is it possible to have a monetary union without a high degree of fiscal integration? I think it's difficult. Or I don't think that the monetary union in the long run will be sustainable without some high degree of fiscal integration. At some point, either the ECB will have to step in and be more proactive, somehow stopping being the ECB that we know, negating itself, that is, not being the ECB like the Bundesbank, or at some point we will have to have higher fiscal integration. With this, I think that's enough. I have the feeling that I exceeded my time, and I knew that. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I just want to ask, is there anyone on the panel? it's a fix, because I know he's dying to say something here. So let me hand over to Jordan, who wants to say
well,
something.
thank you. First of all, I'm very disappointed to see that Dr. Cortareas could not bring his crystal ball due to U.S. customs. I think U.S. Would like to see a solution on this. But let me add, first of all, I agree with your arguments, but let me also add that Greece, or the issue of Greece abandoning the euro and go back to a new drachma, is problematic for the following reason. If Greece goes back to a new drachma, there will be a devaluation, and of course, with a currency that loses value, someone can think that you might have more competitive, or you might be more competitive in international markets, in terms of comparative advantage. But that argument is not founded for the following reason. If you have a new currency, you gain back your monetary policy tools, which is, as we've heard before from Professor Polemarchakis, you can produce money and you can pay your debt and pay any other obligations. But what happens is the monetary policy also, the Greek Central Bank of Greece, will be probably engaged in inflationary policy, which means to finance that, the debt. So that means compared to ECB, there will be again, prices in Greece will go up, and that means they lose comparative advantage. So without comparative advantage, I'm not sure how Greece can grow. I mean, they have to find out what's the comparative advantage and to exploit that. So trade and growth, there is a relationship, strong relationship, and I believe that, this is what Greece have to do.
I see that there are three of you who want to jump in here. Let's just keep it brief because we still have to hear from Senator Blake. I have a specific question for him. John, I think you were first. That you want to do us a brief one?
Let me say a few
use the microphone because.
Let me say a few things exactly then now with respect to the common currency. When the European Union was established, then there was no idea about common currency. They have never thought of a common currency. Why? Because in 1973 we abandoned the gold exchange standard. Countries that are not equal, they cannot have a common currency. They cannot have a fixed exchange rate. And Europe has abandoned the fixed exchange rate. And someone then gets up one day in a meeting and says, why not we cannot have a common currency? And of course the audience says, it looks like a nice idea. And they introduce without any thought a common currency. Those countries are unequal. Germany, France, for example, and other than northern countries, they have different productivity, are industrial nations, completely different than with the south. Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, etc. It was a big mistake, the common currency. And of course, this common currency was appreciated so much, 82% with respect to dollar. The only country that has benefited with the common currency is Germany, because the Deutsche Mark was appreciating faster compared to euro. Germany then increases its export due to less appreciating euro, and the rest of European countries was losing. The only clever response was Margaret Thatcher. In a meeting at a university in Switzerland, she was asked, are you going to join the euro? He said, no, I don't want to turn over the sovereignty of my nation. Even though they have been forced to join, I'm not going to join because I like my country and my citizens. The other nations have no referendum. And without referendum, then they was forced to accept this common currency. And now they suffer. Are they going to abandon the common currency? No, they don't allow them to abandon. Okay? As long as you join, you're going to be a member forever. Then Greece is going to be a member of the Eurozone, and of course, no other nation is going to exit the Eurozone. And after the crisis, the rest of the nations are going to join. This is my opinion.
Okay, thank you. Herakles.
I just want to make a very quick remark.
Can you use the mic so that,
Sure. A quick remark.
Just pull it towards you, yeah.
Okay. A quick remark concerning this issue of printing your way out of debt or the benefits and costs of Greece defaulting. There is a legal change that's very important. A country can print its way out of a debt burden if the debt is denominated in its own currency. The debt that Greece had up until this crisis was debt that had been incurred under Greek law. So by an act of the Greek parliament, it could simply say, I will pay back my debt in drachma that I'm going to print right now. This is, if they chose to do so. This is no longer true. The debt that is incurred right now is in euros. Furthermore, it is issued under British and not under Greek law. So this is an important instrument that Greece has already lost in terms of the benefits of an exit and a default. So this is something that has to be kept in mind, that the legal setup is entirely different.
Okay.
Let me just-
Everybody's jumping in.
Let me just say one really quick thing. First, here are the options. Go off the euro. George just said how terrible that would be. I agree. ECB keeps printing money out the wazoo. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be hyperinflation at some point, or at least it's dangerous. We don't know for sure, but it's a risky policy. Other countries have run in hyperinflations, and they try and do that. Germany starts raising taxes to pay for Greek expenditures. Not going to happen. At some point, the Germans are going to say, forget it. We're not going to cut our spending or raise our taxes to pay for Greece. Greece continues to fiscally tighten. At some point, there's going to be a revolution there. So another military government's going to take over. Or we've got Greece trying to cut prices and wages. Well, they're trying to do that, but it's not happening. In some sense, they're not adjusting. So why is all this happening? I say, again, it has to do with the banks. If the banks were not leveraged, then this would not be a crisis. None of these things would have to happen if the banks weren't leveraged. If people were holding the Greek bonds through mutual funds, those bonds would have lost value. They've already lost value. The owners of the mutual funds would have lost value. The financial system would remain intact, just like all the big mutual funds that were not leveraged remained intact in 2008. None of them failed. The only problem with our mutual funds was the leveraged mutual funds, which were the money market funds. All the other ones stayed intact. That's what we need. We can go to mutual fund banking in Europe. We can allow a country like Greece to default, and we don't have to have all these really bad alternatives. But if we don't go that way, we keep sticking with this banking system, we've got to do one of these really bad things. And that's not going to be pleasant.
Thank you. And I think that's actually a lead-in to my question to Senator Blake. And that is, why should we in Pennsylvania be concerned about what's happening in Greece and Europe? In other words, how is this crisis affecting the U.S. economy?
Thank you, Susan. Before
the map is up there. There you go.
Before I begin, let me say thanks also to Dean Mensa and to Jordan Petsis for the invitation to be here. As the only sitting elected official, I can claim I'm not running for office. My very distinguished panelist here is, and I'm going to look him up right after I get off this panel. I hope you'll bear with me while I raise some comments and some reflections on what I've heard here. And I guess first to our keynote speaker, Dr. Polemarchakis, I had I thought we had problems in Harrisburg. Nothing close to what I've heard here tonight with respect to Greece. A couple of comments and reflections that I want to say, which follow from our keynote address here from the doctor, and also from the follow-up comments of Dr. Kodakov. Elections matter. Was the first thing. I'm going to throw out a few cliches here. I will say that if we don't learn from the mistakes of history, we're doomed to repeat them. Another little cliche. With respect to the most recent comments of my colleague here on the panel, you have a very difficult time putting the toothpaste back into the tube. I think about our American history, and I think about the separation between New York City and Washington and the grand compromise between our fiscal, our financial management systems and our governance. And that gap has certainly closed over the years. And Europe had a different history where its finances and its governance were kind of commingled in the same location. I think the histories speak a little bit to some of the challenges that were here. And I guess the last thing I want to bring up before I give a specific answer is, have you seen It's a Wonderful Life? And you've seen, you know, when there's a run on the bank, you know, well, no, your money's not here, it's in, you know, so one answer to my question is, you know, why does it matter to Pennsylvania and to the United States? Because we are globally connected. We are globally connected. I'm going to tell you two things in specific answer to the question about why does it matter to us here. And I guess it's important for me to, I'm going to quote a few things. You know, we have a pension system. It's called the Public Employees Retirement Board, Public School Employees Retirement Board, and there's also a State Employees Retirement System. They manage about $75 billion in assets. They pay out about $5.5 billion a year to about 300,000 pensioners here in Pennsylvania. And about 65% of the returns that they get are on equity. The money that they depend upon in order to meet those obligations to those pensioners are made by investments. The reality of it is, and I'm going to give you a little quote here. This comes right from, I just came from an appropriations hearing this past week with the Retirement Board, and I want you to listen to this language here real quick just to tell you about exposure. For the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2011, PSERS, which is the Public School Employees Retirement System, investment portfolio generated a rate of return of 20.37%. In the following 6 months, the markets remained volatile while the European sovereign debt issues escalated and the U.S. continued its slow recovery from recession. As a result, PSERS estimates its one-year return for the year ending December 31st at 4.32%. Did you hear what I just said? 20% return plus in the first 6 months, 4% return for the year. Why? Because of what's going on in Europe. Okay? So that's one element of it, and that's not all of it. I mean, our treasurer manages about $51 billion worth of total investments, you know, that come in and has a fiduciary responsibility solely for about $15 billion. And you know, the issue of employer contributions, right? Employee contributions and investment on the equity and returns on that investment are the key to keeping us fiscally sound to meet our obligations. And there's an awful lot of exposure in this. You know, I read a book once, and I love the comments that I've heard from Dr. Kodikoff here on our banking system. It was called The Creature from Jekyll Island. It talked a little bit about the origination of the Fed. And I tell my students in my economics class, and Jordan will be glad to hear this, that we talk about the independence of the central bank. And I never heard the expression of the secrets are in the bank, but I'm going to go look that one up. The secrets are kept there. But I think that, again, we have a system here. Remember that for banks, loans are assets. Okay? I worked at PNC Bank for 3.5 years. Their assets are loans. And it's a little bit upside down from what goes on outside the banking community, right? So I think that we need to be very careful about how we regulate the system. And I think that what we saw here in terms of the origins of the deep recession that led us to where we are right now. One other comment I would bring in a response to the keynote. Oh boy, what does a recession unveil? What does a recession reveal? Because the bet is no one will know. I can tell you that elected officials who don't have the courage to make the decision in the short term are hoping for perpetual growth, right? Our investment portfolios are hoping for perpetual growth. But boy, what does a recession reveal when those predictions don't come true? Because that's why Greece is where it is, I think, in great measure. And that's why the U.S. is where it is in great measure, and that's why Pennsylvania is concerned right now about our fiscal position. One other point I want to bring up in specific answer to the question about why are we concerned, and it has to do with exports. I took a look this morning before I came here, just preparing for it, our top 20 export markets for Pennsylvania: Germany, UK, Belgium, France, Italy, our top export markets. In the top 10 for the U.S., the UK, Germany, Belgium, France, Italy, both in the top 10 export markets for both the U.S. and for Pennsylvania. So we've already, even though the dollar has dropped in value, The fact of the matter is that there is special preference in the Europe. Europe is obviously our biggest competitor in the region for obvious reasons. So the ability for European consumers to purchase U.S. or Pennsylvania products, it's not there. The export story used to be a great story throughout this recession. It was the one area where we still had a little bit of strength, even though it went off deep in 08, 09, and I have numbers I can quote by year. The fact of the matter is it remained one of the more positive elements of economic performance during the course of the recession. And within the past couple of years, 10, 11, we've actually seen a significant lift. But it's softening. It is softening. And the big word that wasn't spoken until Dr. Kolikoff brought it up was the word inflation. Because that's what history tells us, right? That's where the danger is. And when that happens, the spending power is eroded, as you well know, and the ripple effect right across Pennsylvania, right across this nation here, with respect to Europe, could be extraordinarily dramatic. And so that's the answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Did anybody want to respond to Senator Blake, or? Yes,
I would like
John.
to say a few things about the U.S. economy. The Greek economy is only 2.3% of the American economy. Then I don't expect any drastic effect on the U.S. economy after a default of the Greek economic system. I worry, of course, for the American economy, because the debt of the American economy then is much higher than every other nation. Some numbers. The GDP in 2011 was 13.4 trillion. Growth 1.7%. Very low growth than in the United States. Inflation 3% in the United States. Unemployment 8.5%. Official data, because there is an argument before about the data, the official data. We're not sure for the true data. Okay? Gross external debt 8.4 trillion. National debt 15.2 trillion. 113.6% of the GDP. The United States cannot join the euro, okay, because the debt exceeds the 60%, is double of this. The budget deficit is 1.3 trillion, 9.6% of the gross domestic product, much higher compared to all the European nations. The GDP as a percentage of the Eurozone is 107. It's a larger economy compared, of course, with the entire Eurozone, 107%. Listen to the last comment, total debt. The public and private debt in the United States is $156 trillion, 156 trillions. That means 1,165% of the gross domestic product. When the United States is going to pay back this debt? Never. There is no possibility, okay? Then that's why then things are very, very bad globally. This is my last point.
That's a depressing end here. I want to thank everyone. We do have a couple of minutes left. Does anyone in the audience have any questions that they'd like to address to anyone specifically on the panel or in general? And there's a microphone right here in front, if anybody wants to. Otherwise, last word. Yes, go ahead.
Last word. I would like just to make a comment on the presentation of Senator Blake. Just an anecdote from Greece. In early 2010, when the crisis started, the Council of Economic Advisors, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in Greece, once told me, you know, I get a call from Geithner, 1 or 2 calls every day, which testifies to the interconnection. Of course, I told him that he's calling you for the wrong reason.
Yeah.
Well, if not, oh, we have a question. There's a microphone, if you would be so kind. Oh, is it turned on?
Oh,
Yes.
good evening. I'm Helen Dedes in the philosophy department, and I was curious, if Greece left the EU, would it only be because of a default? Or, I mean, I don't wish for a default, but I was curious, do you think then Greece would be pressured to leave the EU if Greece defaulted?
Well, the problem with their defaulting is that if the banks, just suppose that the Greek banks had a lot of the Greek debt, so now the Greek banks are in trouble. So how does the Greek government bail out the Greek banks if it can't print euros? Then it says to itself, gee, we can't print euros. The European Central Bank won't give us euros. Therefore, we're going to have to go off the euro and print drachmas to try and give drachmas to the Greek banks to keep them afloat, keep them running, keep them operating. That's the whole thing. It really comes back to a banking crisis. I'm not trying to say there's a banking conspiracy. I don't believe in conspiracies. I'm just trying to get to the essence of the problem here, which is if we did not have leverage banking, if these Greek banks hadn't borrowed and promised to repay and been in and where their obligators, their creditors, are in a position to close them down if they don't get repaid, this would not be a crisis. We would not be having this meeting. Herakles would not be here. Okay?
No, we need crisis.
And Pennsylvania would not have to worry about Europe being in a recession and not exporting. So unfortunately, we have to take a very careful look at how to fix the banking system so it doesn't keep jeopardizing not just Europe, but our country as well.
Yeah, George is next. Yes.
Okay. If I understood well, your question is what are the possibilities, what are the possible scenarios for an exit? First of all, legally speaking, the EMU, the Eurozone, is like the Hotel California. You can check in any time, but you can never leave. Legally, there is no provision for leaving. So what can happen? One possibility is that at some point the ECB decides, Greece defaults, the ECB decides that it doesn't support anymore Greek banks, and we are stalemate. Another possibility is that before the Greeks or the Italians or the Portuguese leave the Eurozone, the Germans and their satellite countries form another smaller, more stronger currency union, and they decide to leave first. That's another possibility.
But if I can be critical a bit of my colleagues, you didn't answer the question that was asked.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
the answer is that theoretically, at least, Greece can default, okay, and it can stay within the EU. There is no need for it to be, in principle, there is no law that says that if you default, you're thrown out. Now, practically, whether this will, whether the rest of the EU will be willing to put up with this, a different story.
And what happens to the bank 10 minutes later?
Yeah, exactly.
This is not a question.
Yeah.
There can be a bank run.
It's our follow-on question.
There may be a run on the banks. This does mean that you are thrown out of the EU. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, I think the clarification is the difference between the EU and monetary union.
Yes,
here.
and you
The
can be
Eurozone is a different animal. It's a sort of subset within the.
Nevertheless, it is the case
Yeah.
that, as we said earlier, now there is a procedure by which a country can leave the European Union.
Yeah.
There is no procedure by which, until now, by which it can leave the monetary union.
Right.
That's a sinister
That's
detail.
the distinction.
Which
Thank
makes
you.
which make the possibility of one country leaving the Eurozone even more painful, because it will not have to leave just the Eurozone, but it will have to leave possibly the European Union.
Okay, one last question. Oh.
Blake wants to.
Oh, sorry.
Blake.
What's,
John?
there's a microphone over here.
Just-
John wanted to
just
say
one
something.
last-
Yeah.
Just one last
Come on
comment.
over already. Yeah.
Just one last comment real quick, because we're talking about debt. And part of what I learned here tonight, and this plays out. It played out in the city we're sitting in. It certainly played out to some extent in Harrisburg. It's certainly playing out in Washington to some extent. It certainly played out in Greece, is what's the borrowing for? And in the case of Greece, it was borrowing for legacy costs, for public services, as you put it, not for growth, not for an airport, not for a rail line, not for a road or for a bridge or for, or for a healthcare system or for higher education. It was not, so, that's part of what I think in terms of prudent debt, there's a role for that efficiency and that kind of investment, but we shouldn't be borrowing, to fund legacy costs and that kind of public service.
Thank you. The last question, please.
I try to summarize it. I have a lot of questions, but it seems to me that there's been a great transfer of wealth up to a very small percentage of people through non-democratic means. So my question about reforming the system that you brought up, sir, was well said. How do we do that? How do we do that? Because in the United States, we've had 30 years of deregulation, more or less. It's speeded up in the last 20, with the Glass-Steagall Act and so forth. And people know what's happening. We see it. We see the suffering. We see what's going on. How do we address this problem? The IMF seems to have a cookie-cutter solution for every country and so forth. So we're losing our sovereignty as far as I can tell, and I don't know the answer. I would like to hear some, and I want to know why some people who have done fraud in the banking industry are not in prison in the United States as well. You can give me some insight. I'd appreciate it.
Well, so this proposal that I'm referring to is called limited purpose banking. It's been endorsed by some pretty famous economists and policymakers, George Shultz, the former Secretary of State and Treasury, Bill Bradley, Robert Reich, Bill Niskanen, who ran the Cato Institute, Simon Johnson, Herakles, Ken Rogoff, a lot of, these are kind of who's who in economics, Jeff Sachs, from the left, right, and center. And even Barney Franks likes this idea quite a bit. Mervyn King, the head of the Central Bank of Bank of England, has talked about this proposal publicly. Well, really, it's pretty simple. You just take the banks that are now debt financed, and you do basically what's called a debt to equity swap. You convert their debt liabilities into equity liabilities. There's ways to do that pretty quickly, actually. And then we would have a safe banking system, and the bankers would have to do one thing, which is intermediate. They'd have to be boring bankers. They wouldn't be gambling, taking our money, promising, gambling with it, and telling us to bail them out when they lose and taking the upside when they win. So all the problems that we saw go away. I don't want to try and hawk a book here, but let me hawk a book. It's called Jimmy Stewart is Dead. John referred to It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy Stewart is this honest banker who's caught up in basically a dishonest system and almost kills himself realizing that he's actually made promises he can't keep. And he gets saved, and by a miracle, he keeps safe his bank because he's a good actor and a good speaker, and there's no bank run because of his intervention. But it just shows you the fragility of the current banking system. So Jimmy Stewart is Dead is saying we can't rely on Jimmy Stewarts. They're dead. Not that all the bankers are bad. There are Jimmy Stewarts out there. I think John's one of them. I think the other people here at the table are. But we have to have a system that's immune to bad bankers and just to a system that is really in many ways fundamentally corrupt and needs to be made honest and safe. And it was also a custodian for this market, and we can't let anybody take a gamble with it. It's too important to the economy. 29 million people out of work or short on work will tell you this is just far too risky a way to run a financial system. The whole, yeah. So it can be done, and limited purpose banking is the answer. And the fact, I didn't even mention there's 5 Nobel laureates. 5 Nobel laureates in economics have endorsed this plan too. I didn't even mention their names. Getting 5 economists to agree to anything is not easy.
Do you see it as politically doable?
When I'm president, it's going to happen.
Can I add something? Okay.
Yeah, let's talk.
I agree 100%. The problem is that economists are not like doctors. They cannot prescribe therapies. We can tell our opinions, but it's politicians, and actually it's people through the government that make the decision. So this reform will take place only if people understand that this is necessary. Okay, so if there's a crisis, please don't blame us. Okay, because in the end, always people make the decisions. This is how democracy works.
Yeah, and the Greeks know about democracy.
We know that very well.
No, if there is a problem,
Don't blame John Blake and don't blame Greeks, I think.
Yeah. I have a feeling that we could keep going on this for hours. We started early this afternoon in informal conversation, and it's just kept rolling. But I'm afraid that somebody's going to yell at me if I don't call this to a close soon. So on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank all our visitors, and also my colleagues, too, because they chipped in. I think this has been a really fun day and a great evening's conversation. And I want to thank the students who helped organize this, the club officers and so forth, because I know we worked you hard, some of you, in getting this organized. And thank you, everyone, for your patience with us this evening. And I hope that we can find another excuse to do this again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.